Hello all, my name is Rick Boas and this is my critical assignment in the form of an ethical leadership presentation. My ideal career is a dualistic one that consists of coaching baseball at a junior college and hopefully being able to teach at that same college, most likely in the field of kinesiology. Being the head coach slash manager of a baseball coach comes with several duties. First off, I'm responsible for recruiting players and hiring coaches. It's my team. I need to know who I want on the team and who's going to help me coach it. Along with that, I've got to create the workouts. That consists of conditioning, weightlifting training, practice plans, in-game strategy, who's going to start, who's going to sit on the bench. I also need to be able to communicate with the athletic director to follow what our school wants. And I'm also the person who has to talk to the media if that ever comes up. And then lastly, I have a duty to build the players as young men as well as athletes. It's not just about winning on the field, but it's also about winning off of the field. As a college professor, my primary goal is to effectively communicate material to students. In order to do that, I'm going to need to create lesson plans as well as assignments that are immersive and force students to retain information. And in order to test that, I'm going to have tests at the end, possibly essays that gauge how much information they're actually retaining. And then, of course, I've got to grade those things. And although most people might not think it, I think a professor also has the duty to build students as people and especially as academics. It's not just my job to teach information, but I need to teach them tricks of the trade, how they can start teaching themselves over time. So on to leadership styles. Unfortunately, because this is a dualistic career, there is no one style that fits both sides. So I have to be proactive in incorporating two different styles effectively. So as you can see, I have definitions from our book for both a transformational leader as well as a servant leader. Transformational leadership style aligns perfectly with being a baseball coach. If I can make my players feel like they're part of a team and inspire them successfully, their goals will start to line up with my goals, and I will have a strong, cohesive unit. Then we will all be focused on the same goal of winning. And not only that, I will also have players that will buy into my philosophies a lot more easily. A professor is more of a servant leader than anything else. As a professor, our primary goal is to help students learn in any way possible. I don't have an ulterior motive of getting everyone to pass per se. I'm much more of a support system that's there to assist students in their learning in any way that I can. A transactional leadership style does not work well for either of these career paths. There is no real trade-off of action and reward. You might think that students turn in their work and they get back good grades in return, but it's not so much a transaction as it is them earning their grades themselves, and I'm just there to assist along the way. Next up, we have some effective leadership strategies. First off, we have integrating humor, which was looked at by Korobkin in 1998. Humor is important for teaching and coaching both, because if it's successfully integrated, then you are more relatable and personable to your subordinates, which means they're more likely to like you as well as listen to you. You have to be careful, however, because not all humor is good. There's humor that uses derogatory terms as well as any kind of abusive humor is much more likely to cause negative effects. Next up, we have effective teaching methods that were looked at by Carpenter in 2006. Carpenter used a pre-test and a post-test along a semester to test the efficacy of each of these teaching methods. First, he looked at Jigsaw, which is essentially students being grouped into fours, which each one of those students being required to read a portion of the reading for the night. Then all the students get back together and discuss what they read, so the whole group of four learns from each other. This produced the best results, but it was disliked the most amongst the students. Jigsaw probably produces these results because students are now held accountable to one another and they do not want to let each other down. And it's probably disliked for that same reasons, because students do not want the responsibility of having to read and relay that information to their peers. Next was the lecture method. That's your standard professor giving a lecture to all the students where they just listen and or take notes. This method was the most liked by students, but it produced very poor results. This is likely due to the fact that students do not listen or take notes effectively, but they do enjoy this method because they can slack off per se, or maybe are not as responsible for learning the information. Carpenter urges us to avoid case study and group project methods. They produce poor results as well as being disliked by most students. This is likely due to the fact that case study is where a student is responsible for learning information on their own, and then group project, instead of being like Jigsaw where each person is required to do a part of the learning, it's kind of a free-for-all, and often not. Group projects are done by one person instead of the whole group. Lastly, we have effective coaching behaviors that were looked at by Hollenbeek and Amarose in 2005. Essentially, they looked at what kind of behaviors increased intrinsic motivation in players. An intrinsically motivated individual is much more likely to buy into team goals as well as exceed expectations. They found behaviors that were democratic to do this the best, and that's not surprising because a player that feels like they're included in decision making is much more likely to feel like they're included in the team. So these behaviors included positive feedback and emphasizing training and instruction as part of the teaching. Hollenbeek and Amarose also suggest that we avoid any kind of autocratic behaviors, and that makes sense as well. Anything that is just basically telling players what to do with no reasoning behind it. Players want to feel included. So next up we have some potential and very likely ethical issues that I will face in this dualistic career. First we have alcohol and drug use. Secondly we have student-athlete grades. And lastly there's student autonomy versus teacher authority. Each of these are going to be looked at with some possible solutions. So first up we have alcohol use. It's an issue for teachers and coaches alike. I looked at a study from Linklater, Melman, Presley, and Cashin in 1998. They found that athletes on scholarship and men are more likely to abuse than their non-athletic counterparts. This is obviously important as a baseball coach because I'm going to have male athletes as well as several athletes on scholarship. They also found that there's a strong correlation with binge drinking and sexual violence. So like I said earlier, part of my job as a teacher and a coach is to help these young adults become better people, act morally. Binge drinking is not moral, and neither is any kind of sexual violence. This is important for me as a coach because any player that gets in trouble because of the use of alcohol or any substance will likely be kicked off my team, and that will affect my chances of winning, especially if it's a scholarship athlete. As we look at drug use, I'd like to focus on performance enhancers, using a study from Bostrom and Roach in 2008. It's different for teachers and coaches. Most performance enhancers you're going to see on the sporting field are going to be steroids or some other kind of body enhancer. Whereas in the classroom, you'll see abuse of drugs for focusing. Adderall is a drug that's used for patients that suffer from attention deficit disorder. But those who do not suffer from ADD, who use Adderall, generally have an edge in focusing or staying up late to finish assignments. Watching the use of alcohol and drug abuse is important for teachers and coaches both. One, because underage drinking is illegal, as well as illicit drug use. Not only is it illegal, it's generally not good for people to abuse. And like stated earlier, as a leader, I need to be looking out for the well-being of my subordinates, and excessive alcohol and drug use is not part of that. So some simple solutions to this problem. As a coach and a teacher, I need to actively look for signs of alcohol and drug abuse. This could be anything from smelling like alcohol to missing repeated classes or showing up late, looking lethargic all the time. I also think it's important to inform your followers that you've been there and you've done that. I personally played college sports. I've been around the partying. I've done some of it myself. Yes, it's fun, but you need to be smart at all times. And on that note, you have to maintain an open line of communication. You have your students and your players need to know that they can trust you and come to talk to you about problems, especially for their peers. If say a player sees the team captain doing something, he needs to feel comfortable coming to me as a coach to talk to me about, hey, I'm just looking out for Tim's best interest, and so that's really important. And then lastly, NCAA already requires sanctioned teams to go through random drug testing. I think it would be smart for colleges to adopt the same thing for their standard students. We don't want anybody doing drugs that they should not be doing, not just athletes trying to gain a competitive advantage. Next up, we have student-athlete grades. Obviously, as a teacher, we want everyone to succeed in our classroom. But as a coach, I need everyone to succeed in our classroom. I can't have people becoming academically ineligible and hindering the team's progress. I use a study here by Purdy, Eitzen, and Hufnagel in 1982. They found student athletes to perform worse academically than normal students, and they were generally less prepared than standard students. They also found that African American athletes, scholarship holders, as well as athletes in major revenue sports to perform worse than even other athletes. So this is a big issue for me as a coach. Generally, my scholarship athletes are going to be my most skilled players. So if any of them are performing poorly in the classroom, then the team's going to be at a severe disadvantage. An easy solution to this is to address any GPA that's below a 3.0, and this can be addressed in several ways. First off, I'm going to hold a weekly study hall that's ran by team captains. Players will have to sit there in the library for 2 hours and do homework, study for tests, whatever they so please, as long as it's school related. On top of that, they're going to be required to hand in weekly grade reports that are signed off by their teachers. And on that note, I'm going to have to keep an open line of communication with their professors. If they feel that my players are struggling in any way, that they need to know that they can contact me and it will be dealt with appropriately. And then for students and student athletes alike, most schools hold free tutoring, and it needs to be taken advantage of if anyone feels they're struggling in class. Lastly, we have student autonomy versus teacher authority, and this was looked at by Bain in 1993. This dilemma is essentially the constant balancing between a teacher's authority and controlling situations for a student's well-being versus a student's autonomy, which is them being more self-reliant and being able to handle situations themselves. I write that this is a minor dilemma with major consequences because it might seem minor, but if a teacher is taking control of every situation, then a student is not growing as an adult. I can't, as a teacher, just teach information and then give good grades. I need students to start to learn the material themselves and become better academics in the process. I'm not doing students any favors by doing everything for them. I need to help them grow as human beings. And so some solutions to this is just to constantly weigh consequences, both pro and con. And I feel like if you're keeping a student's best interest in mind, then you should be able to do a good job at this. You're just trying to do what's best for them. And if that's helping them at certain points, then that's what it is. But there's going to be times where I need to let them figure it out on their own. And then similar to the jigsaw teaching method, maybe start doing classes that are more student-led, like discussions where students have to carry on the conversation themselves, and I'm just there in more of a support role. And lastly, I have some Bible verses which are going to help incorporate a Christian perspective into these leadership strategies. Over here on the left, I have Solomon speaking in the book of Ecclesiastes. Essentially, he's saying that leadership is very similar to faith. It's based on belief. Just as we believe in God, we should believe in ourselves. Because really there is no correct formula to leading. You got to find what you believe is best for your followers, what's going to give the best results, and you got to stick to it. People don't respect a leader that's wishy-washy. They need to stand their ground. It's hard for a follower to believe in your teachings if you don't believe in them yourself. And lastly, we have Solomon again speaking in the book of Proverbs, where he goes on to say, "Train up a child in the way he should go. Even when he is old, he will not depart from it." This is important because college coaches, teachers, any kind of leader play an integral part in making young men and women into who they're going to be. We have an ethical duty as leaders to, push our followers into being as moral and virtuous as possible. And on the flip side of this, if we're not doing a good job as leaders and we ourselves showcase poor moral and ethical decisions, then this is likely to affect our followers in negative ways now and in the future. Lastly, here are my references. That is it for my presentation. I hope the information was received as it was intended. I had fun doing this, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. Thanks.